In our last video, we got to the point where we could put settlements like this on the map, with interesting spatial distributions and reasonable hierarchies of sizes. In case you're new here, all of this is procedurally generated, including the terrain and lakes and rivers and things like climate and resources that are determining these settlement locations. And this kind of map is already starting to look like you could use it to build a setting for a fantasy story or a TTRPG campaign, but so far all we can say about these settlements is their location and their size. And that's interesting, but I don't think it gives the map that larger-than-life fantasy feeling. Like when we're thinking about the genre conventions of fantasy, very frequently the current state of a city is less important than the weight of its history. When we first get to see a city, we're often treated to a voiceover or a few paragraphs about who built the city and who overthrew them and what foul curses have befallen the city over its existence. A fantasy world is often many millennia old, with some amount of history and institutional memory of events that span those millennia, and the cities have a longer and more complicated history than anywhere in the real world. I'd actually argue that cities old enough to make Aleppo look sleek and modern are a defining feature of what we think of as the fantasy genre, and so that's something we want to be able to capture with our map generation. Incidentally, in putting this video together, I found it helpful to go back and reread some classic novels and see how their authors have handled the idea of people living in worlds that really have thousands of years of history. Tolkien, of course, handles this by making his narrator a disembodied far-future academic voice with a lot more context on the world than any of his characters have. He treats us to a whole fairly stuffy prologue in Fellowship of the Ring about the ethnogenesis of the hobbits as a people. It's a testament to his writing ability and the richness of his world building that this even partially works. In Isaac Asimov's 1952 book, The Currents of Space, it's tens of thousands of years in the future with all kinds of advanced technology, but people don't have a great grasp on history, partially because popular memory of the past has been distorted by racist, pseudoscientific narratives that have even shed doubt on whether humans all did really originate on Earth. I'm not going to say this book holds up in its entirety. The plot does kind of require a corkboard and red yarn to keep track of, but Asimov did accidentally foretell the kinds of theories that the algorithm will show you if you scroll too long. In a much more expansive world, where characters can have longer conversations from many different perspectives, George Railroad Martin gives us an incredibly ancient world with no way to document itself. So the first men and the building of the wall and all that big spectacular magic happened tens of thousands of years ago. And some of it is theorized about by the maesters, and some of it comes down through folk tales of rustic commoners, and none of it is really fully clear. The author is doing some deliberate obfuscation here, and sowing ambiguity, and that decision on the part of the author lets us accept ancient larger-than-life constructions like a magical ice wall in a grim and gritty fantasy world. And finally, in Anne Leckie's criminally underrated The Raven Tower, the world is ancient, but the narrator is a deity, and it's not entirely clear they're reliable in any of their descriptions of what's happening. So you get a grand scope of history, but you don't necessarily get perfectly accurate documentation of everything going on. I don't want to spoil this book because you really should go read it, but trying to visualize the world that Leckie builds here is a big part of what prompted me to start thinking about fantasy map-making software in the first place. Anyway, welcome back to Multiversal Map Room, where we're writing procedurally generated fantasy map software that will never match those legendary fantasy authors, but will hopefully be a useful world-building tool. This week, we're layering lore onto our settlements. Conceptually, our game plan here is pretty simple. We'll be dividing the history of the world up into eras. In each era, a settlement has some status. For example, it's inhabited or uninhabited. From one era to the next, a settlement can transition from one status to another. For example, from uninhabited to inhabited. This is going to happen at random, possibly depending on its history or size or environment. More on that later. And then we're just going to iterate through multiple eras and multiple transitions between these statuses to get deep lore for all the settlements on the map. As with pretty much everything, this is all going to be configurable, so you can change the number of eras or the persistence of settlements over time when you're generating a new map. So right now all settlements can be in one of two states, inhabited or uninhabited. And you might think of a really basic model of what happens as we advance time from one era to the next is that settlements can transition between these two states. Of course, they can also stay in the same state from one era to the next, and I guess we could have arrows that loop around and point at themselves on each of these rectangles, but that would get messy, so just imagine those if you like. We could imagine adding a couple more states for our settlements to represent everything that can happen over the passage of time. For example, we might think that if a settlement has been inhabited for enough consecutive eras, it becomes an ancient city with a lot of rich history and maybe some ancient arcane lore going on that's enabled it to last from one era to the next. Conversely, from one era to the next, an inhabited settlement might become abandoned ruins. And let's add some more arrows to indicate those transitions are possible as time moves from one era to the next. Of course, if inhabited settlements can either become ancient cities or ruins from one era to the next, and an ancient city never stops being an ancient city and ruins never stop being ruins, that means that if we run a few eras worth of history for our map, every settlement will eventually end up being either an ancient city or ruins. So we need some ways for settlements to lose these status conditions. To add a little realism, let's say that ancient cities can also fall to ruins, and ruins can decay into ordinary uninhabited settlement locations. I'm also going to say that the rate at which ruins decay into ordinary uninhabited settlements is going to depend on the climate, so ruins last longer in especially cool or dry places. Once again, let's add some arrows to reflect those additional transitions. Now we have 4 possible states for our settlements in any given era. Most settlement locations are going to be the standard inhabited or uninhabited locations we've been talking about for the last couple videos, but some settlements that are continuously inhabited over multiple eras will become ancient cities, and some will fall to ruins, and eventually ruins decay back into uninhabited settlement locations, and the transitions between these statuses from one era to the next is always going to be probabilistic. This is starting to look like a reasonable set of potential states for settlements to transition between. I'd actually argue this captures the kind of transitions we'd see between settlements in the real world before the Industrial Revolution and the massive growth of modern cities. But for the purposes of generating maps of heightened, larger-than-life fantasy worlds, we can go a bit further and add a couple states that accord more with fantasy genre conventions about worlds that last thousands of years. Specifically, we're going to be adding holy cities and cursed cities. You can think of these as cities with some kind of good magical stuff going on and cities with some kind of bad magical stuff going on. And I'm going to keep this really vague because obviously the specific interpretation really depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. These are both going to be sources of arcane energy, and holy cities will obviously have a higher probability of being a big city and lasting longer, whereas cursed cities will reduce the probability that the surrounding cluster of settlements has any inhabitants whatsoever. In terms of transitions, holy cities are straightforward, ancient cities have some probability of becoming holy from one era to the next, and holy cities have some probability of losing their holiness and reverting back to ancient cities. Cursed settlements happen when inhabited settlements or ancient cities become cursed from one era to the next. I did experiment with holy cities also having some probability of flipping to cursed, but it made it harder to keep consistent holy cities across many eras, and it didn't really change the overall distribution of settlement types after a few eras, so I took that out. Cursed cities can decay from one era to the next to ruins, which of course decay back into uninhabited settlements. So these are the 6 states we'll be working with, and the arrows show the transitions between them. With the passage of sufficiently many eras, a single settlement could, in the fullness of time, theoretically transition through all 6 of these states, although that's very unlikely to happen unless we iterate through hundreds of eras. To summarize this another way, here's a table of which transitions between settlement types from one era to the next are allowed in this model. Some of you might look at this and think, ooh, this is a Markov process, so after a few eras, any map will always converge to the same distribution. And if you are thinking that, that's great news to me, because it means that this video is reaching its target audience. But As I mentioned previously, some of these transitions depend on climate variables, and some depend on the number of consecutive periods for which a settlement is inhabited, or the size of the settlement, and those dependencies mean that we don't have a straightforward constant transition matrix that's going to give us that Markov-style same long-run distribution of settlement types for every map. To get a sense of how this all works in practice, here's that map from the beginning of the video, but with a somewhat busier legend. I've also marked all the uninhabited settlement locations with little X's, to emphasize that from one era to the next, the set of possible settlement locations always stays the same. We're trying to build a map of how things look after many eras pass, so of course we want to let settlements accrue lots of history. And with hundreds of possible settlement locations on the map, keeping the set of possible settlement locations constant from one era to the next is not that steep of a restriction. Anyway, on this map we have three great metropolises in the northwest and southeast and southwest, and the one in the southwest by the inland lakes is surrounded by a hinterland of towns and villages. So you might think of this as an era with multiple prosperous civilizations in different parts of the map. Of course, in the context of the eventual map we'll actually care about, this is ancient history, many eras in the past. So let's step forward to the next era of time. This era is maybe a little less prosperous, with fewer large cities. One village from the previous era has survived to become an ancient city, while another has left ruins in the far northwest. After just one era of iteration, we're already starting to get some history, and maybe some sense of a region in decline. The third era has shifting populations, not much changes substantively. The same is true in the fourth era. We now have 3 cities in the north that have fallen to ruins. In the fifth era, though, that ancient city that has withstood the test of time over many eras has grown into a holy city. The largest population centers, including the 2 great metropolises, are in the northeast, but the one holy city on the map is on that southwest continent. Already I think this offers some world-building potential for how pilgrimage might work, or even how a government might be structured if it's theocratic. But we can keep layering on more history. In the next era, another village that's been around since the first era, nearby to the Holy City, becomes an ancient city as well. So now there are multiple cities in that one region that persist through many eras. Note that not every settlement that's inhabited in every era becomes an ancient city. For example, the 2 settlements on the island in the southeast have been inhabited in every era so far, but they're just still inhabited settlements. The idea is that an ancient city is more than a place that's inhabited in every era, but it's in some sense survived from one era through to the next, and so it has the deep lore and secrets and magic that you'd expect to accumulate over time like that. These 2 centers persist in the next era, even as the rest of the population shifts across the map. Incidentally, you may notice that islands are more likely to be inhabited in this version of the settlement population algorithm than in previous videos. I've tweaked things a bit so that settlement locations on the coasts of islands are a little bit more likely to be inhabited, because those locations are generally pretty great for trade and transportation and defense, and also makes for a more interesting map. In the next era, a lot of things have changed. Our second ancient city has become a holy city, and a new ancient city has arisen in a location on the northern continent that's been inhabited since the start. Meanwhile, 2 cities in the north and south have become cursed. The big inhabited centers are on the eastern side of that northern mountain range far inland, and the map has multiple holy sites and multiple cursed sites, and another ancient city far away from those big inhabited centers. We're getting to the point where there's ample storytelling potential, even for a novel or a TTRPG campaign that doesn't need to explore the entire map. In the next era, another city on that remote southeastern continent also falls to the curse. This is getting to be a hazardous part of the map. Also, note that some of the ruins in the north have persisted for many eras, because this map is set up so that the northern continent is quite cold and dry, so ruins are more likely to stick around there. In the 10th era, another city next to the 2 holy sites becomes an ancient city, and another city in the remote southwest becomes cursed. now we have a map with a wide range of settlement types, including a big metropolis in the northwest, 2 holy cities, 2 additional ancient cities, 4 sites that are thoroughly cursed, and ruins scattered across the map. This is about the kind of lore and history that I think is interesting for a fantasy story or a TTRPG campaign. There's enough variety in settlement types and sizes, the map has big empty areas and isolated ruins, and the settlements cluster in areas where they maybe make sense. An adventure that takes characters across the map, or political intrigue between various civilizations, or even a casual conversation between drunken sailors about faraway lands would have enough to work with from what we've generated here. And based on some experimentation, 10 eras seems like an approximately reasonable time frame to get the variation we want. Here's a completely different map in its first era. Instead of stepping through, let's just skip straight to the 10th era for this one. As you can see, the passage of time has left a holy city, an ancient city, and a cursed city really close to each other around that lake in the southeast. Meanwhile, large parts of the map are entirely uninhabited. This map is much warmer and wetter than the previous one, so ruins don't persist as long. But overall, this also feels like a map where interesting stories or lore drops from a deep iceberg of world building would really make sense. Finally, let's go through one more example to really see how we get lore building up over time. This map starts with its population centers really concentrated in the west, with big empty regions on that main eastern continent. Once again, let's iterate through the eras and see what changes. The next era immediately gives us an ancient city, as well as a cursed city. The efforts we went through in the last video to ensure that isolated singleton cities keep showing up on the map mean that we can get an ancient city surrounded on all sides by wilderness, as well as a cursed city in the middle of nowhere. Isolated cities like these probably wouldn't make sense in the real world, but in a heightened, larger-than-life fantasy world, this kind of isolated settlement feels like it has a lot of storytelling potential. In the next era, the center of population is really migrated to the east. The ancient city and cursed city remain, but they're increasingly isolated across the map from everything else. It really feels like the settlements are oriented around that big metropolis in the southeast. An era later, the cursed site in the west has fallen to ruins, but another has arisen to take its place in the east. Multiple other settlements have also become ruins since the last era. In the next era, the population centers are all near the center of the map, with a really built-up region around that lake in the foothills of the mountains. Meanwhile, whole swaths of the west have no settlements whatsoever. As time goes on, populations migrate, ruins decay, and every location on the map ends up with a deep history that's maybe worth exploring in your story, or maybe just hinting at. But the goal here is that every location should have that history accessible if necessary. Incidentally, this map is all fairly temperate, and so big cities make sense pretty much everywhere on this map, and now you can see that the big population centers are all clustered up north. Ruins have started to accumulate a little on this map. At this point, we have half a dozen ruined cities. That's going to happen sometimes, just because this is all randomly procedurally generated, but I do think we want to keep ruins relatively rare, like ancient cities and holy cities and cursed cities, because that rarity makes them feel special and unique. But also, maybe a map with a ton of ruined cities from bygone ages is an interesting location for certain types of stories. This might be something I need to revisit in the future. At any rate, at this point, we're in a situation where the one ancient city and the one cursed city on the map have been there for many eras, and the population center has moved around from one era to the next, leaving ruined cities in its wake. A map with one big continent like this leaves a lot of room for empty land. Like, now the western half of the map is just an empty wilderness with scattered ruins. And that continues through another era, even as populations shift again and almost no settlements are left south of the mountains. Finally, in the 10th era, that ancient city that's been there since the beginning falls to ruins, and another ancient city arises to take its place in the north. An ancient city that stood for eons has fallen into ruins right in the center of the map, and you might think those ruins would be a particularly fruitful location for some kind of stories to happen, or at the very least for characters to be aware of. Meanwhile, the the cursed city remains, and in fact, one of the largest metropolises on the map is right next door. The distribution of inhabited places looks pretty realistic, but also these interesting, unique sites have some long justified lore to them. And, of course, this map never produced a single holy city in 10 eras. I think this kind of interesting outlier is a big part of what motivated me to use this kind of algorithm with all its randomness to build maps. You can really end up with worlds that look nothing like what you planned for, but then that surprise ends up prompting world building potential or storytelling potential like you never would have expected. Anyway, that's all for this week. As always, I'm grateful for feedback and suggestions, so don't hesitate to leave a reply. As we all know, liking this video and subscribing to this channel will mean that more people see this project, and that's pretty much my sole strategy for promotion, so I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.